I was born as my mom's only child and my dad's youngest. And what that meant was that I grew up as a very observant kid. I was always watching the world around me, and I was in a lot of spaces with adults. So I had a lot of observing that I was able to do. And growing up Black biracial, my mom is white and my dad is Black, I moved between vastly different worlds very frequently. And as a sensitive and observant kid who felt like I was a part of two worlds, but also neither, began to see through school, through social activities, through my different friend groups that I had, that we're living in a very unjust world. In Los Angeles, where I grew up, I saw the ways in which white people moved in the world, and I saw the ways in which Black people moved in the world. And I asked a lot of questions of both my parents and other adults in my life. And what I was left with was a feeling that the privileges that I was afforded as a result of having a white mother, as a result of having two parents who were employed full time, as a result of a variety of things, I grew up with this profound sense of injustice, that there was nothing different about me that meant that I inherently deserved those privileges. This isn't to say that I didn't believe that I was special in some way, that I have gifts to offer, but that my comfort, my opportunities, and the other aspects of my life had very little to do with my character. And there were a couple of instances where friends of mine who were Black or brown did not have those privileges afforded to them, and it just lit a fire in me. I'm very empathetic, and I became very protective of our liberation. And I never made peace with the notion of the social hierarchy that we've been sold. And when there is no peace in this, if we reject this caste system, this racial social caste system that has been designed and wielded against Black and brown people for centuries, if we fundamentally reject the premise of that, then there is no other option other than activism.
There is no other option other than activism. How have you translated your earlier experiences into this work, the connections that you might have, and then just sharing with us about these intersections?
So one of the things that I often say is that I've been studying trust my whole life, but I didn't know it. So in earnest, about 15 years ago, when I entered graduate school, was when I really named it. But it's one of those phenomenon that I have studied in one way or another through my own personal study, through my own personal existence as a bridge builder in many ways. And so one of the examples that I often share is I shared my mom is white, my dad is Black. And it's really interesting because growing up, my mom used to say, you trust people until they give you a reason not to. And so everyone starts for her with a baseline level of trust. And that trust gets eroded based on what they do, what they say, how they treat you. My dad, on the other hand, as a Black man growing up in Los Angeles, who grew up in the South, in Kentucky, he would say, you absolutely do not trust anyone unless they prove that they are trustworthy. I grew up with these very different
Yeah.
definitions of trust. And it took me a long time to understand. I'm like, which one is it? And so the path that I forged, which is often the path that I walk, is let me see what's true for me. And what's true for me, I've discovered, is somewhere in between the two. I can empathize with people, but I've learned enough to know that a blind trust of everyone is harmful. But if you look at who my mom is, she grew up on a farm in Nebraska. They did not have a lot of money. Like, she did not grow up with a ton of privilege outside of being a white woman. And my dad, who grew up on a farm in Kentucky, like these two people who actually had very similar backgrounds in terms of their upbringing, had vastly different experiences of trust based on their race. And I would argue gender as well. About 15 years ago, and had been a special education teacher in Los Angeles for about 10 years. And one of the things that I noticed as a special education teacher was that student success often depended very heavily on adult relationships. So when you have children who have autism or cerebral palsy or other special needs, there are often many providers who are part of that student's support and care team, parents, principals, teachers, right? There's lots of actors. And the ability to coordinate those services and to provide a coherent, sort of culturally relevant experience for that student. For example, does a student who speaks Spanish at home get speech therapy in Spanish or English? There's all these questions that start to come up. And then when you zoom out into the education system more broadly, there's the school board, there's the superintendent, the cabinet, right? There's all these different people who are making decisions on behalf of students. And those students, how much funding goes to special education students, right? Like how many counselors are on staff? There's all these decisions that get made. And what I noticed was that the ability of adults in school systems or surrounding school systems to understand one another across cultural divides and to build trusting relationships, when those trusting relationships were in place, students thrived. When the parents trusted the teacher, when the teacher trusted the principal, when they understood even across difference, when they had ways of communicating with each other, that it made a student's educational experience better. And so I wanted to know, how does trust operate? What is happening from this cultural perspective in this fundamental building block of our relationships? And through my doctoral journey and my dissertation, I discovered a lot about how trust operates.
All
But
right.
but
I bet.
but namely that the vast majority of the work that has been done around trust, our popular consciousness, if you want to think about it that way, has been shaped by predominantly white men. I won't list them all, but a lot of the scholars, popular thought leaders are white men, and if not white men, white women. Very few popular definitions, conceptualizations, articulations around how trust works from the voices and perspectives of people of color. And so I wanted to know, okay, what do we think about trust? Like, I've read all these books and that didn't tell me. And so let me just ask people. So that was essentially what my study was about. Trust is often defined around characteristics: honesty, integrity, reliability, competence, right? There's all these different sort of characteristics. But when you drill down into what do those characteristics look like for different people, there's a lot of cultural nuance that goes into how those characteristics are defined and perceived. All that I often use is competence. I'll just take myself, for example. If I am a Black woman in a predominantly white organization or institution, the definition of competence that is imposed on me through employee evaluations or even more implicitly might be different than a definition of competence than if I'm in a different environment. And so what I perceive to be competent may not match the cultural definition of competence that's in the
Mm.
institution that I'm in. And that is something that, unless we talk about how trust is informed by culture and by power, that is not immediately apparent when we just say, I trust you if you're competent.
That has implications for the experience within that organization too. And so unless we talk about it, we're operating under those norms. Our understanding of trust has been whitewashed by popular thought leaders. It's void of cultural nuance.
Yes.
And what are some other things to understand about the importance of cultural differences? And not just defining it, but having a candid, clear, out in the open conversation around it, because sometimes like those dynamics are always present but are rarely addressed.
A couple things. So my journey around understanding relationships, it started out very personal, right? With my own experience growing up as a multicultural kid in a multicultural city. Rodney King happened when I was a young person. The O.J. Simpson trial happened when I was a young person. I grew up in a time in Los Angeles, and also hip hop happened. Like
Yeah,
West Coast hip hop was at its
yeah.
prime when I was growing. So I grew up in this context of joy and pain, which many of us did. I can't imagine a time when there aren't both of those things, and we're seeing that now. But the cultural contrasts that were happening when I grew up, I noticed. And so it was like my understanding of trust that was formed when I was young was very personal. As I got older, it became professional. And when I was building trust with families as a teacher, building trust with students, right? I then had to operationalize it in a professional context. When I went to grad school, it became very conceptual. And that, I think, took me away. It was part of the assignment, so I get it. And I'm glad I learned a lot. But it pulled me away from a fundamental truth about trust that I have had to find my way back to, is that the way that I enact trust in my relationships is wholly dependent on the way that I enact trust in myself. I cannot have a relationship with someone else unless I have that relationship with myself first. And that is complicated, right?
Mhm.
That requires understanding my relationship to power, my relationship to culture, my relationship to so many things, while concurrently navigating relationships outside of myself. And so I think that's the first thing, is that our relationship to trust starts with ourselves. And we are worthy of that examination, because I have not seen an example or experienced an example of where someone can trust someone more than they trust themselves in a healthy way outside of
Mm.
parent-child relationships. I think that's different, but as an adult. So that's number one. Number two is, as a result of the way trust has been framed for us as this binary, right? It either exists or it doesn't, right? As a result of what I believe to be white dominant frames that have been imposed on our concept of trust, where it's this paradigm that lacks depth and clarity sometimes, right? What I believe is that it is almost impossible for us to have the same definitions of trust. It's like love, right? Love can be enacted in so many ways. There's a whole body of work around love languages.
That's
It's
right.
it's something that you could never define for someone else, but can resonate in description, right? There's poetry, there's music. It's an art form. And in that same way, our relationships are art forms too. And could never say to someone, I did this thing, so you have to trust me. That would be like me saying, I bought you flowers, you have to love me, right? Not
Yeah,
saying
which
that's not
people
a
do.
thing.
They do it, but like you say, it doesn't mean that there's trust there, right? Yeah.
And what I often try and stress is that the goal is not to have the same definitions of trust, but to have the tools to understand each other's definitions of trust. Because then we can actually build solidarity, we can build bridges, we can accomplish anything because we know how to engage in conversations about repair when trust is broken. We know that, oh, Rolanda doesn't care if I'm on time, but if I say I'm going to do something, I better do it. You know what I mean? Everyone, like for me, it's communication, right? I'm cool with pretty much everything as long as we're in communication.
Yeah.
That's what builds trust for me. But that's not true for everyone. Some people are like, don't call me. I don't care. I don't really want to talk to you. But it's something else. And there's no way to know unless we have the tools, which aren't always words. There are lots of different tools out there to be able to understand what trust means based on who you are, what you've experienced, and what's meaningful for you.